not sure how familiar people are with Sunfiber, so I'm going to start with a little bit of background and basics, and then we'll build more and more to the prebiotic benefits as we go through today. So for those of you that aren't familiar, Sunfiber is 100% soluble fiber that is produced from the guar bean. It is also called guar fiber or partially hydrolyzed guar gum. If you look in the literature, you might also see it referenced as PHGG. It is a soluble fiber that when mixed with water is tasteless, colorless, odorless, and also has a very low viscosity. So it makes it very easy to work with from a formulation standpoint, but also enjoyable to consume for the end consumer. All of our guar is grown and processed in India, and essentially what it is the soluble fiber is extracted from the guar bean. It is treated with an enzymatic process, and it results in a long linear fiber. And of course, since it's a scientific presentation, we have to have at least one scientific chemical structure there to the lower left. So a few more facts about Sunfiber. It is a very well-researched fiber, has over 180 published studies, including over 120 human clinicals. So there's a lot of research here, and I'm really trying to distill it down to the main studies that focus on some of the main health benefits as well as the prebiotic benefits. It's a FDA-approved dietary fiber. It was also the first fiber that was certified low FODMAP by Monash University, which I will talk a little bit more about that and what that acronym is a little bit later. In addition, it's organic, non-GMO, informed ingredient, kosher. As you can see, we have a lot of different certifications that make it desirable for both consumers as well as formulators. So I know we're talking about prebiotics today, but I kind of wanted to at least start with a little bit of a description of dietary fiber, since sometimes these terms are used interchangeably. And there is some overlap, but there is some distinct differences. So the FDA definition, which they announced about 6 years ago now, it really is the, non-digestible. And when they mean non-digestible, they mean non-digested in the small intestine, therefore it gets to the large intestine of soluble and insoluble carbohydrates. And I really wanted to highlight that these can be intrinsic and intact in plants. So think of the fiber that's in an apple versus an isolated fiber like Sunfiber, which is taken from the guar bean and isolated, then can be added back to food and or dietary supplements. So there's a distinct difference that the FDA creates here. And what they did with their new definition, as they mandated that all these fibers determine that they have a physiological benefit to human health. They called out 6 different areas, which are fairly common for various dietary fibers, but not all of them do this, whether it be blood glucose, cholesterol control, decreases in blood pressure, improvements in laxation, improvements in mineral absorption, and or reduction in energy intake. Thankfully, Sunfiber, having all this human clinical research that is out there, we meet a lot of those health benefits. Probably the most well-studied is regularity. So aiding in the transit of all the gut contents through the gut and producing a more frequent and also more comfortable to pass stool. Can also help with occasional constipation and diarrhea. Attenuation of the postprandial glucose response can also help lower cholesterol. Can promote some increase in fullness and decrease in hunger or satiety, as some people refer to. It can increase some mineral absorption. I'll talk about that here a little bit later. And then, of course, why you're all here today is the prebiotic benefits. And I'm going to kind of start with some of the older definitions of prebiotic benefits, as well as kind of what people commonly associate it with. So I know Len had mentioned, prebiotics being the food that feeds beneficial bacteria groups, and that's where we're going to start today. The most common group that probiotics help promote are bifidobacteria. That is a beneficial group, and we've had quite a few studies that have looked at that. The first one was in 2014, and it provided a 6-gram dose of Sunfiber for 2 weeks. And really what they saw was a significant increase from baseline of the bifidobacterium levels in the participants. So since then, we've conducted 2 more studies that are using the gold standard clinical design, a randomized double-blind placebo-controlled studies. A recent one in 2020 provided 6 grams of Sunfiber to athletes for 4 weeks. And what they were able to show there is not only was there an increase in bifidobacterium levels, there was also an improvement in, we'll call it functional laxation markers as well. So an added benefit of increased ease of defecation as well as less diarrhea reported in these athletes. And that is a common thing that is reported in extreme athletes that, you talk about people that run marathons, or in this case, these were people that played soccer, so high intensity athletes do have that. So that was a benefit in addition to the gut microbiome. And lastly, we had another study using a good clinical design that used 5 grams. So that's a 1 gram lower dose. So that's a positive, and it also confirmed the increase in the bifidobacterium levels. And like the previous study, it also showed a significant improvement in the stool consistency as measured by the Bristol Stool Scale. And why do bifidobacteria increases matter? Well, if you see people with IBS, they actually tend to have a little bit of, we'll call it dysbiosis, and you see decreases in bifidobacterium levels in some of those patients. So that could explain why this is a beneficial group. So moving on, the next most popular group of bacteria that you see referenced are the lactobacillus. And we saw some increases in these levels using the earlier plating techniques. Some of the earlier studies for Sunfiber tended to use higher doses as well, as you'll see here. The first one used 7 grams given 3 times a day, and they did see a significant increase in these lactobacillus levels. A second study provided 11 grams twice a day, and it also confirmed the increases in the lactobacillus levels. The only thing about this is the newer studies really haven't been able to replicate these results, possibly because they're at lower doses, or we're using completely different techniques now. So I would say it's not as clear if it's a lactobacillus promoter or not. So moving beyond the 2 classic groups, just looking at some of the other modulation of the gut microbiome that Sunfiber can do. One of the things that we saw in a more recent study was actually increases in bacteria groups that produce butyrate, which is something that Mallory talked about a lot, and I'll talk about a little bit more in detail. So that's something that was really positive, and that was at a modest 6 gram dose. And I also wanted to kind of show the graph here on the right that shows over a 12-week period how much fluctuation you can have within individuals, just to show how dynamic the gut microbiome is in individuals. So we showed that it promotes the increases in certain bacteria levels, but how does that occur? That occurs via the fermentation. And what we observe is that Sunfiber produces high amounts of short-chain fatty acids, but it preferentially promotes higher levels of butyrate, which is obviously a fantastic thing for the gut epithelial lining, but also just good for systemic health. One of the negatives of fermentation, which I'll touch on a little bit more later, is that this generally produces gases as well. These tend to be carbon dioxide, hydrogen, and in some people methane. And obviously the quantity, the rate, and the location of where that occurs in the gastrointestinal tract can impact tolerance. And we'll discuss that in a little bit more detail later. So the data here on short-chain fatty acid production is pulled from in vitro studies. So that is going to be adding a set amount of fiber in a closed system and letting it ferment for 48 hours, and then measuring the short-chain fatty acid production afterwards. And what I wanted to demonstrate here is that proportionately, you're seeing a much higher level of butyrate being produced. In the first study, we're comparing against inulin, which is another common prebiotic fiber. And you can see that Sunfiber produced almost double the level of butyrate compared to inulin. And then in a second study, looking at some other fibers, you again see higher butyrate production, but I also wanted to show that there's a lot of variation in the percentages here, because you're looking at two different studies. You have different inoculum from human feces that does impact what bacteria are there, therefore what short chain fatty acids can be produced. But again, that trend is a high level of butyrate production. So all of that was conducted in an in vitro model, but obviously we're more concerned about how does this impact human health or animal health. So the first study that I'm going to talk about, used a mouse model, and why that is, something I'm talking about is because we can be a little bit more invasive in an animal model than we can a human model. This showed that giving Sunfiber compared to a placebo group significantly increased not only butyrate, but propionate and acetate, and that was measured in the cecum, so the first part of the large intestine. And that's just something that's really hard to do in humans, but it just showed that there was high production, because when we look at human studies, as we're going to talk about in these next couple, it's a little bit harder to measure, because as soon as these short chain fatty acids are produced, they're rapidly absorbed, and we're really only measuring the residual, and it's approximated that about 95% are absorbed in the large intestine. So it's a little bit harder to detect differences. And then looking back at that 6-gram study from 2014, we did observe an increase in the absolute amount of fecal butyrate compared to baseline. However, this was not significant. I wanted to note that. Thankfully, a recent 2022 study using a much stronger clinical design showed that a product containing 5.2 grams of Sunfiber actually significantly increased the butyrate level in the stool. In addition, there was increases in propionate as well as total short chain fatty acids compared to control. So again, we see a very consistent improvement in butyrate in both the in vitro, animal, and human model. And we know that that is very beneficial to gut health. So as I mentioned, there is that negative side effect of fermentation, which is that gas production. I'm not aware of how familiar you are with FODMAPs, but that is a term that was coined by Monash University, and that essentially groups together a lot of dietary components, generally shorter chained or sugars of carbohydrates that do cause people digestive issues. And the acronym stands for fermentable oligosaccharides, disaccharides, monosaccharides, and polyols. And what I wanted to highlight is the top two in the right column there. A rapidly fermented carbohydrate such as inulin, that is definitely one of the class of things that cause people problems, and I know Mallory touched on that earlier, as well as some of the shorter chain prebiotics like FOS and GOS. Those kind of get encompassed in these this FODMAP group that tends to cause people issues. Obviously, the FODMAP is more important for people that have digestive issues like IBS, because they're even more sensitive than the general public. But these tend to be a good gauge of if it's going to be tolerated in a normal person as well. So one of the issues with these FODMAPs are twofold. First, they can cause an osmotic effect because they are poorly absorbed in the small intestine, which that can cause pain, distension, looser stools because you're getting more water in the gut. And really what we're more concerned with is the gas production, because if the gas production occurs very rapidly, or in the more of the proximal colon, it tends to be perceived more painfully than if it's done more distally. So a more slowly fermented fiber is going to generally be better tolerated than something that's rapidly fermented. So we'll take a pause here, and we're going to switch gears and go into prebiotic definition. So I talked about what the FDA classifies as a dietary fiber. Now we're going to move to prebiotics. And the definition I chose came from the International Scientific Association of Probiotics and Prebiotics, or ISAP. That is a scientific organization out there that put forth a definition for prebiotics. There are other definitions out there. They're all relatively similar. There might be some nuance, but essentially they're classifying it as a substrate that is selectively utilized by the host microorganisms, so your gut microbiome, conferring a health benefit. So what are some of those health benefits that they called out? As you can see, improved gut health, cardiometabolic improvement, increased mineral absorption. Those really kind of overlap with your fiber definition, but then you have some other things that maybe go beyond that typical fiber. So immune stimulation, inhibition of pathogens, and mental health. So I'm going to discuss some of the evidence we have for Sunfiber for these benefits in the next couple slides. So with gut health, we know that Sunfiber produces high levels of butyrate, as I showed earlier. Well, what does that look like, and how does that affect the gut epithelial line? As you can see here, this is a rat study that provided a control group of rat feed, a liquid diet, which tends to have less components like fiber and other things to help feed the gut microbiome. And then they had the same liquid diet fortified with some Sunfiber. And as you can see, you have the nice healthy villi on the left. You know, you can see significant atrophy and problems there in the middle. And then Sunfiber mostly helped attenuate any sort of those issues with that diet. So you can see that it really does help enhance the gut health. Moving on to another animal study, you can see this one used a colitis-induced model. So you can see the healthy colon of the mouse there on the upper left. You can see after introducing the chemicals to induce colitis, you can see a lot of atrophy, you can see inflammation, you can see just a generally unhealthy colon. And then with the same treatment, but added supplemental Sunfiber, you can see that production of butyrate and other benefits really help attenuate a lot of those negative effects of the colitis. And then this actually only occurred in a 7-day window. So it's really quick and rapid that was able to show that benefit. So here is sort of a unicorn in the science on Sunfiber that I really wanted to highlight, because it shows a lot of different things occurring all in the same study. So this study looked at 13 children with chronic constipation and autism spectrum disorder. These children received 6 grams of Sunfiber per day for several months. And what we were able to see is, first off, an improvement in stool output, going from only 2 stools per week and almost doubling it to 4. So that's kind of getting you from that constipation frequency of bowel movements into more of that normal area, which is obviously a benefit for those children. But also we looked at some inflammatory cytokines, and we were able to see that Sunfiber was associated with some significant decreases in interleukin-1 beta. And then also we tended to see decreases in IL-6 as well as TNF-alpha. So you can see kind of a decrease in inflammation that's associated with consumption of Sunfiber. And here's the most interesting part of this is they also took a standard questionnaire that was assessing irritability, and they were able to find that these children were less irritable after consuming Sunfiber. And it kind of points to a modulation of the gut, improvement in relaxation, also leading to almost that gut-brain axis to improved mental health as well. And the figure there on the right is from that study and just kind of showed how the Sunfiber modulated various gut microbiome. So moving on to the second benefit of prebiotics that was mentioned is looking at the blood glucose. We have several different types of studies that we looked at. The first one was just a simple glycemic index test, adding 5 grams of Sunfiber to bread, found a significant decrease in the glycemic index, as you would kind of expect from a fiber. A follow-up study added, using a randomized controlled trial, using 4 grams of Sunfiber combining with rice, and they found in the postprandial period a attenuation and a blunting of the max glucose level, as well as a decrease in the area under the curve over a 4-hour period. Lastly, there was another study that looked at diabetics who consumed 5 grams of Sunfiber twice a day with meals. And they saw after a 6-week period that they actually had a decreased hemoglobin A1C. So that's a relatively small amount to lead to a meaningful biomarker for diabetics. So essentially, the data is pretty consistent that you have a decrease in 3 different markers of blood glucose control. Moving on to some of the cholesterol benefits, I just highlighted 2 studies here that provided different doses of Sunfiber and showed how it can decrease some of the postprandial markers. The first one did 5 grams and 15 grams, and you can see that obviously the higher intake group saw a more pronounced decrease in cholesterol, as well as blood glucose attenuation, which builds on what I talked about on the previous slide, but also a decrease in fatty acid, which was consistent amongst the 2 doses. A more recent and lower dose study gave 6 grams of Sunfiber in a yogurt with a high-fat meal and a high cholesterol meal, and they're actually able to show that postprandially we saw a decrease in the area under the curve of cholesterol as well as triglycerides. So again, you're seeing a benefit of consuming fiber here. So moving on to mineral absorption, a recent 2021 randomized controlled trial examined 19 female athletes that had a lower iron status, and what they were given is a synbiotic containing 6 grams of Sunfiber and some probiotics for 8 weeks, along with an iron supplement. And what we were able to see is that in addition to just taking the iron, the synbiotic, including Sunfiber, actually significantly increased their iron storage and their serum ferritin. So again, we're seeing a enhancement of mineral absorption with the fiber consumption. However, this study didn't look at a mechanism of action. It didn't look at the gut microbiome, so it's hard to directly link these, but it is definitely promising research in this area. So moving on to the immune benefits, another 2022 randomized double-blind placebo-controlled study looked at the 5.2 grams of Sunfiber. This one I talked about earlier in context of short-chain fatty acid production, but this study also looked at measuring the cold symptoms as well as some immune markers in these participants over a 12-week period of time. And as I mentioned earlier, we had a significant increase in short-chain fatty acid and butyrate production, which we know has some impact on the immune system. We saw some modulation of immune markers in this study, but almost more importantly to me is what's the net result of that? And what we saw is participants reported significantly more symptom-free days for various symptoms, including significantly lower days with a runny nose, a plugged nose, less malaise, and then, as you'd expect from a fiber, decreased constipation and diarrhea days. So that was kind of nice to see all that in a study together. So here is something that we don't have any human data on, and kind of hard to introduce pathogens and bad things into humans and study it. IRBs don't like that. Nobody likes that. Nobody wants to participate. But what we did have is 2 studies where this was done using young hens. And essentially, hens were supplemented with Sunfiber in the diet, and then they were given salmonella. And what we see in these 2 studies is a decrease in the amount of salmonella on the egg, and more importantly, in the egg white and the egg yolk. We're seeing a decrease in that with the Sunfiber consumption. And also, in the first study on the left, we actually saw no salmonella detected in the feces after 11 days, whereas the control group had salmonella detected in the feces for the entire 21 days. So essentially that's clearing that pathogen out of the GI tract more quickly. And the second study was more confirmatory. That also looked at the gut microbiome, which again, it showed the increases in the bifidobacterium and the lactobacillus levels, and a decrease in enterobacteria, which tend to have some maybe bad guys that we don't like to see. Again, this no salmonella in the feces, on the surface of eggs, or in the egg white or egg yolk. So there's some preliminary evidence that Sunfiber may help decrease pathogens. So I wanted to come back to the prebiotic benefits that I mentioned earlier in the presentation, and really looking at, how does Sunfiber stack up with some of the clearly demonstrated benefits, and it actually stacks up fairly well at pretty good modest doses. The one thing I didn't talk about was mental health. That's something that we just don't have any data on. That's a newer area that we really haven't investigated yet, so we really don't have any data to share or make any sort of determination. But really, if you pull it back to human data in support of, we really check 4 of the 6 boxes, which I think is very encouraging. And I hope that you all think of Sunfiber as a prebiotic to definitely use or to investigate more often, because I think that it hasn't been thought of as a prebiotic as much as it's been thought of as a great fiber to use. So with that, I will conclude. I'm sharing my reference.